Welcome to Speaking of Our Words, a production of the Kenosha Writers Guild. We are bringing you in this format a series of videos to allow you, the viewer, the opportunity to experience the oral reading of the work of local writers, a rare opportunity. Additionally, for your enjoyment and to give you insight into their creative process, we will interview the writers right here about their work. I'm Marshall Smith. I'm your host. I'm a published poet and studied creative writing in the MFA program at the University of Iowa Writers Workshop. Today, Ron Larson of the Kenosha Writers Guild will read from his book and talk to us about his work. Ron, a hearty welcome.
Great, thank you.
Thanks for coming in again, because we interviewed you, I guess it might have been 3 or 4 months ago. That was a terrific interview. And welcome back.
Great, thank you.
So you might start off by sharing, by reading something of your work today, and then we can talk a bit.
Okay, all right. So let's see here.
This is from your book entitled?
It's Wisconsin in the Civil War. It's published by the History Press, which is part of Arcadia Publishing, and it was published in November of 2017. So a year and a half ago.
And it's here in the Kenosha Library, I'm going to believe.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
okay.
And my goal is to get it into every library in the state.
Okay.
We'll see if that happens. Right. So what I'm going to read is, each chapter has a different topic, and so I devoted a chapter to the Wisconsin's Native Americans and the war's impact on them and their contribution, to Wisconsin during the Civil War. So, in which we can talk about all that later. But approximately 500 Native. We don't have an exact number, but approximately 500 Native Americans from northern Wisconsin enlisted in Wisconsin regiments during the Civil War. That was new information to me. So this is part of that. This is the chapter. It's chapter 12, and so I'm just going to read a couple paragraphs here. Wisconsin's Native Americans offer their services. All right, so this is at the beginning of the war. Less than a month after the firing on Fort Sumter, a, quote, mixed-blood Menominee trader living near Oshkosh, Wisconsin, named Robert Grignon, offered Governor Randall the services of 200 Menominee warriors, quote, well armed with rifles, sure at 40 rods, and anxious to serve under the Stars and Stripes, unquote. The letter was ignored. The reason, according to Augustus Gaylord, the Adjutant General of Wisconsin, was that there was some doubt as to the propriety of using Native Americans, quote, in the present contest with our brothers, as long as there are volunteers from, quote, civilization. Despite the state government's rejection of the organized enlistment of Native Americans, in the first year of the war, dozens of Brotherton, Menominee, Oneida, and Stockbridge-Muncie men enlisted. They went unnoticed because they enlisted as individuals or in small groups. For example, 7 Oneida men enlisted in the 11th Wisconsin Infantry in October 1862, but they were put in 3 different companies. There was also an arbitrariness to Native American enlistment. Some were accepted into Wisconsin's, quote, white regiments, while others served in the U.S. colored troops once colored regiments were authorized. So then I go into details about numbers, and then on the next page I say, by 1863, volunteers from, quote, civilization were harder to acquire, and a draft was instituted. Native Americans were exempt from the draft, but they could enlist or serve as substitutes for white men who were drafted and earned large bonuses. Many of them took advantage of the opportunity. Although Wisconsin's Native Americans served in many regiments, they were concentrated on a few. About 20 Menominee men served in Company K of the 17th Wisconsin Infantry. 6 of them enlisted in early 1862. The regiment participated in the Battle of Corinth and the Siege of Vicksburg. One Menominee soldier, John Kitson, was wounded in the assault on Vicksburg. 2 others died of disease. The largest single group of Native American soldiers in a Wisconsin regiment were the Oneida of the 14th Wisconsin Infantry. No fewer than 47 of them served. 39 served in Company F, and at least 8 more in Company G. In the words of Elijah Stockwell, Jr., a member of the regiment, quote, Company F was a big part Indian and good skirmishers, unquote. So then I go on, but that gives you a sense of,
I very interested in the word, and I found it interesting reading your stuff. In fact, two words in there and their context during that time: propriety and civilized or civilization. It seems to have a special application within the context of that time and the way Native Americans and African Americans as well were viewed. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Right. So, I mean, in that day and age, Native Americans were not considered, civilized, right? And that the whole thing was about civilizing them. They were savages and so on, right? And even if they were, like some of them were, would be living in white communities, or they were fairly well kind of integrated within a white society. Most lived in the reservations, farther up north. But so this was still very much. I mean, again, this is the 1860s. I mean, they're still out west. The Army, is and will be fighting Native Americans for the next 20 years, right? So they're still very much in the midst of this kind of war, right, against these uncivilized savages. Right? And so that gets back to the propriety issue, where early on, the war is just starting, and Governor Randall and the powers that be in Madison were like, it would be like unseemly to use these savages, in a war against our civilized Christian white brothers, down south, right? So
they were brought in a back doorway by not being drafted, but being allowed to enlist in the placement in place of a white person. Is that kind of how that was going?
Right. I mean, because they were Native American, they couldn't be drafted. They weren't citizens in that way and not subject to the draft. But they could enlist, and they could take the place of a white man who was drafted, and be a substitute, what they call substitutes. So, if you were some big businessman or lumberman or whatever up in Oshkosh or Green Bay or, whatever, and you got drafted, it's like,
you could find a way out.
You could find a way out, sure.
And I also remember reading, I don't think it was in that piece that you just read, but I think it was a particular general had remarked how well the Native Americans fought as part of the fighting body, and there was a particular quotation, I think, is, and even under discipline. I think it was some phrase like that, which was to imply, I gathered, that as far as working as disciplined soldiers, they were excellent.
Right, and then this was kind of a question, to these white, officers and, their white compatriots or whatever, like, being from, being near savages, uncivilized, how would they take to Army discipline, and following orders and marching and standing, and, like any human being, they adjusted to it, you know what I mean? And it's a prejudice, you know what I mean? I mean, sure. Native Americans and like anybody is as capable of following orders or discipline or courage or cowardice, for that matter, as anybody else, So, but in their mind, this was a real question. I mean, in fact, the same applied to African Americans. I mean, there were many, white people at the time who felt that African Americans wouldn't be good soldiers. You couldn't, because again, they were like not as evolved. They were more like savages.
Right. Interesting. So we went over this a little bit last time, but I just want to give our audience a little bit of insight into this. In writing this book, Wisconsin and the Civil War, what was your mission? Why did you do this? Why was it important to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the primary reason, because why do this? The last book written on the subject was published in 1997 by Frank Clement, who was a professor at Marquette. And so, that was about 20 years, right, prior to me publishing this book. So a lot has happened, and two main things have happened in that time. There's been a lot of good scholarship, especially on, women and the Native Americans, the African Americans. I included that in this book. And so, like, populations, like the trend in history of the last generation has been to look at peoples who haven't been looked at before, right? Kind of marginalized, or and so there's been a lot of good scholarship done in that area, or those areas. and also the internet. So now it's literally, instead of me having to go to an archive in Madison or Washington or whatever, a fair amount of the material that you want has been digitized and it's online. When I did my master's in history in the early 2000s, I was looking at hundreds of hours of microfilm of newspapers.
I remember those days.
Civil War newspapers, right? And it's not word searchable. You know what I mean? And now, you have this technology that just, so it really,
accelerates the whole learning.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's much easier to do more research.
So given the limitations of, say, Professor Clement, is that his name?
Right, Frank Clement, yeah.
Okay. In terms of his research, and then you using the digital world and being able to search out, was there new information revealed that hadn't been revealed before that you were able to record? So we now had a narrative of history that was richer than it had been?
Right, yes. And that's why I kind of knew, so to speak, to do the book. That, I had a master's in history. I got that in California in the 2000s, and then I did some other graduate work up at UW-Milwaukee. And just from doing research and doing some scholarly work up there, I was aware of the fact that there's been all this research that's been done in the last generation on, again, like these kind of marginalized or overlooked populations. And so I knew that was there. I knew it was there. And then it's a question of going into it and looking at it and deciding, what to put in the book or what not to put in the book. And so there's brand new information, research on Native Americans and women. And in fact, African Americans, there's a man by the name of Jeff Cannell, who is another, he has a day job somewhere, but he's an independent, scholar. He has a contract with the Wisconsin Historical Society to do a book on Wisconsin, just on Wisconsin's African Americans. And he's done a lot of research, and he let me use his unpublished research, in the book. And I gave him credit for it, and a note and everything. But so
that's great.
Yeah. So I knew that these stories that hadn't been told before, like this information was there, and so that's wanted to get it out there.
So when one does this sort of research, does it sometimes develop that there end up being in the body of literature on history about a particular event contradictions? Did that ever happen to you? I'm just sort of imagining it could, that so-and-so believed that this was what really happened, and then further research and study develops that, well, maybe it didn't quite happen that way.
Sure, and that's kind of like a common theme or trope in historical research, right? Is you uncover new information which puts prior, thought into question, right?
Does that become political?
It can, well, this is totally off the subject, but I think at the 50th anniversary of the Hiroshima bomb, so 1995, the Smithsonian was going to do an exhibit with the Enola Gay and about the bomb. And it became so controversial that they basically scrapped it, and it
wasn't worth it.
Yeah, it wasn't worth the headache.
Acrimony.
Right. Because of the whole question of the bomb, the morality of it, was it necessary or not, whatever.
Sure.
So in this case, one small example, and again, Frank Clement was a great scholar and a great teacher, but his book is not annotated. And he mentions, on one page, he says there were 10,000 Native Americans living in Wisconsin in 1860. On another page, he says there were 9,000. But I have no idea where he got this information,
right,
because it's not annotated. So I'm like, okay, so I go back to the census data, as well as the Bureau of Indian Affairs reports. Because because Native Americans on the reservations were not part of the census.
Right.
So basically, it was like guesstimates by the Indian agent, at that particular reservation. Long story short, it was like a detective story trying to figure out what's the best estimate I can come up with. And it's like 5,000. The actual number I think I put in the book is 4,000 to 6,000. So it's about half the number that Clement had. And again, I wish I knew where he got that number, but I just, maybe there were others that were not counted and were kind of, but so it could be more.
Right. You do the best you can on what you got. Yeah. Would you be able to read something else, please?
Sure. Now the question is what, right? You know what? I think I'll read. So we'll do an African American thing here. So you know, in 1860, there were not a lot of African Americans living in Wisconsin, right? There was a little over 1,000. You know, in the census, I have the number. It's like 1,100 free colored. You know, were living in Wisconsin, mostly in Milwaukee and the Racine area, and then out west in the western, like in the Driftless area by the Mississippi. There were actually communities of escaped slaves and freedmen that formed communities out there. But so the point is that, you know, the vast majority of Wisconsin people and Wisconsin soldiers, their first interaction ever seeing, you know, an African American was down south, right? Was on the plantation, was as a slave, right? So anyhow, so I'll just read this little under a page here. Wisconsin soldiers and freed slaves. Given the small population of African Americans in Wisconsin at the time of the Civil War, the way most Wisconsin soldiers interacted with African Americans was on campaign in the South. Undoubtedly, the first African American most Wisconsin soldiers encountered was an escaped slave or, quote, a contraband coming into federal lines. A good example of this is the story of Peter D. Thomas, a 14-year-old slave in western Tennessee, liberated when Wisconsin troops occupied his plantation in 1862. Thomas later recalled that, quote, the Yankees came on our plantation and told us we were all free, as they were, and could go where we pleased. It seemed too good to be true, but as our owners said nothing, we knew it must be true, unquote. Thomas became the servant of Captain Charles Nelson of Company G, 15th Wisconsin Infantry. He was with him for the next year and a half, and present at the battles of Chickamauga, Missionary Ridge, Resaca, and others. Captain Nelson was wounded at the Battle of New Hope Church in Georgia on May 28, 1864. So this is like the Atlanta campaign. Thomas helped Nelson return to his home in Beloit, Wisconsin, to recover and worked on his farm. Several months later, Thomas traveled to Madison, Wisconsin, and enlisted in the 18th U.S. Colored Infantry. He served in the St. Louis area until November 1864, when his regiment was ordered to Nashville, or took part in the Battle of Nashville and the pursuit of General Hood to the Tennessee River. Afterward, the regiment served in Alabama and Tennessee, mustering out on February 21st, 1866. After the war, Thomas returned to Beloit to gain an education. When he enlisted in 1864, he had to sign his name with an X. He was illiterate. He eventually became a teacher in Chicago, ultimately settling in Racine, Wisconsin, where he was elected county coroner. So talk about a trajectory, right?
Wow.
That's amazing.
Wow. Yeah, it's you and I were talking a little earlier. It's I think that many of us have some sense of the African American participation in history and maybe the Civil War. It's very limited and certainly not by any means complete. The Native American aspect is particularly interesting because, at least for my part, I had no idea about any of that. And it sounds like when we were talking about this, that was something that you experienced as well, sort of, wow, I didn't know this was going on.
Right. No, I know there was I'm trying to remember when I discovered this article, but there was an article written by somebody who works for the Historical Society in Madison. It was published in, the Wisconsin Magazine of History in the 90s. And it's called Not Wanted in a White Man's War. When it was about what were called the Green Bay tribes, so the Oneida and the Menominee up by Green Bay, and so he details a lot of their contributions, and I use some of it in this book. But the point is when I began the book, I had no idea, and it was once I started doing the research and well, wait a minute here. I mean, what's the deal here? Did a lot of Native Americans join the, and once I found out, oh my God, yeah, then, it ends up being a chapter. And again, it was a revelation to me. I had no idea.
So being from such a different background, environment, culture, the Native Americans, nevertheless, according to what I read in your book, were in many cases, very willing and loyal. What motivated them?
I mean, that's a good question, and and I talk about that in the book, and like any group of people, I suppose, and individuals had their own motivations, but you can kind of generalize, to a degree. One motivation was, conditions then, like maybe now, aren't so great on the reservation, right? Economic distress, and so here was this chance for, you could get a $300 bonus. Later in the war, once the draft is instituted.
A lot of money.
A lot of money back then, and you get a steady paycheck. And in fact, Wisconsin during the war had established a fund where each family, like a dependent, like the wife or the family of a soldier, would get $5 a month. So, same thing for them, you know what I mean, once they joined. So there was the economic motivations that are always there, probably for every group. But also, another motivation was some of these tribes, like the Menominee, were always here. But the Oneida, and the Brotherton and the Stockbridge Munsee, they were moved from farther east, right, earlier in the century. And part of the motivation was, if we help, if we fight for, the federal government now, then maybe they'll be, they won't move us again, And then the other motivation, which I have to mention, which I find really interesting, is the Oneida were part of the Iroquois Confederacy, right, in the East Coast during prior to the American Revolution and so on. And during the American Revolution, the Oneida were our allies against the British, right? And so, some of them stayed in New York, and they're still there, and part of the tribe was moved to Wisconsin. So in their mind, they consider themselves allies of the United States. So it wasn't that, oh my God, we're gonna do this, out of fear or something, or it was, they consider themselves an ally of the United States, and that if the United States was at war, they would go to war, So again, it was this kind of mixture of motivations, but
sure, everybody has an individual motivation ultimately. Sure, that makes sense. So what's important to you in terms of what your readers get out of what you write, what their experience is in reading what you write? What's important to you in the bigger sense?
Well, I mean, so two things, I think. One is I want them to learn something, and so to learn something. That's the whole point, is tell stories that haven't been told before. So I want to tell them stories they haven't heard before, and also for them to enjoy it, or to think, oh my God, this is interesting, or
Sure.
it's well written or whatever. But I mean, just for them to have the aesthetic experience, to enjoy it. So it's both of those motivations, right?
Now, your book won an award in 1995. Can you tell us about that?
Well, so what that was I worked on a documentary on the Revolutionary War for the Learning Channel in the mid-90s, and it aired in 1995. It's the Revolutionary War for the Learning Channel. Charles Kuralt narrated it. So the last things he did before he died, and in '96. It won the ACE Award, the Cable ACE Award for Best Documentary Series. I was the head text researcher on it, so I was doing all the research, and I helped structure the documentary and everything, with the writer and the producer. So anyhow, that award no longer exists. It was absorbed by the Emmys, like all the cable stuff, right? So the cable shows win Emmys now, right? But back then, prior to that, it was the ACE Awards. So
that's great. That's really great. Congratulations on that. I'm sure you're very proud of that. You should be.
Yeah.
You put a lot of work into it.
Yeah, it was a year and a half. We worked on it for a year and a half, then before it aired.
Yeah.
And it's rewarding in that, it was really fundamental in help structuring the documentary, and so it's a kind of rewarding feeling to.
So I know when we spoke last, you were beginning or working on something. What's next for you, Ron? What do you envision for the next project, or what's going on?
Right, good question. So, recently in the previous few years, I've gone to conflict zones. I was in Libya in 2011, and Syria in 2013, and again Turkey 2015, and was interviewing Syrian refugees and fighters. And so I want to do something with that material. You know, that's kind of like high. It's number high on the agenda. And then after that, I do plan to, you know, I'm moving back to LA. I plan on moving back to LA this year, and do want to re-enter narrative historical film and television.
I see. Okay. Well, we don't have a lot of time left, but I want to ask you. I didn't get to ask you last time. You mentioned that you've been on in the battle zones in the Middle East, in those countries. How has that changed you?
Well, you know, I mean, that's a, you know, good question. I mean, it gives me an awareness and an understanding of what it is like for those people living there. You know what I mean? And so, and I still have friends back there, and so, you know, when they're talking about ISIS and northern Iraq and Syria. I mean, I was in Syria, I was in Iraq earlier. I just, you know, I mean, I know what they're going through,
right,
and I understand it because I was there.
A more complete understanding. That's great.
Right.
Well, Ron, I want to thank you very much for coming in and sharing your excellent work with us and talking to us about your work and how you do it and what's important to you and all those things. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
This is Speaking of Our Words. It is a production of the Kenosha Writers Guild. Please come to one of our meetings, which are on the second and third Thursdays of each month at 6:30 p.m. at Carthage College. The meetings are open to anyone, and we welcome your attendance. Ron, again, I want to graciously thank you for coming in, sharing your work. Where might we find your book again? Is it available on Amazon? It's here in the library?
Right, it's the gift shop, the Civil War Museum, but yeah, Amazon.com or the publisher.
Great, great. Please visit our website at KenoshaWritersGuild.com or like our Facebook page and feel free to leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. Until the next video, I'm Marshall Smith. Goodbye.